Sometimes a man's entire life can change with a single lie. This is the story of Detective Marcus Hale, a man who gave everything to this city for 27 long years. He gave his unwavering loyalty. He sacrificed the best years of his youth. He poured his heart and soul into serving and protecting. And one false accusation, one moment of injustice, took it all away in the blink of an eye. Detective Marcus Hale had been a cornerstone of the city's 11th precinct for over 27 years. He wasn't just another face in uniform. When people saw him walking down the street, they would nod their heads respectfully, not out of fear or intimidation, but out of genuine respect and admiration for the man he had become. Marcus Hale wasn't just a police officer punching a time clock. He was something much more precious and rare in today's world. He was the seasoned veteran who stayed behind after his shift ended, sitting patiently with rookies who had just experienced their first traumatic call, helping them process what they had seen and teaching them how to carry the weight of human suffering without losing their compassion. He was the man who showed up at funerals, not just for fallen officers, but even for the criminals he had arrested over the years, because he understood that every life had value and every death diminished the community in some small way. Marcus believed deeply that justice wasn't something you simply wore on your chest like a badge or carried in a holster like a weapon. True justice, he knew, was something you carried in your heart every single day. It was about treating every person with dignity, regardless of their circumstances. It was about being fair when fairness wasn't easy, and showing mercy when mercy wasn't popular. His personal life was as modest and humble as his professional demeanor. He lived in a small, quiet house on the outskirts of town. The most prominent decoration in his living room was a carefully folded American flag displayed in a mahogany frame by the fireplace, a memorial to his father who had served in Vietnam. His beloved wife, Margaret, had passed away 10 years earlier after a long battle with cancer, leaving a hole in his heart that never quite healed. His only daughter, Sarah, had moved to Oregon after college, pursuing her own dreams and building her own life, as children should do. All Marcus had left was his job, his calling, his purpose. And for 27 years, that had been enough. More than enough, actually. It had given his life meaning and structure and hope. For nearly 3 decades, Marcus Hale's record was spotless. Not a single scandal had ever touched his name. He had never taken shortcuts or bent the rules for personal gain. He had never received a single formal complaint from a citizen or a fellow officer. His personnel file contained nothing but commendations, letters of appreciation from grateful families, and performance reviews that consistently rated him as exemplary. He was known for his clean badge, his firm handshake, and a reputation that seemed as solid and permanent as granite carved in stone. Fellow officers looked up to him. Community leaders respected him. Even the criminals he arrested grudgingly acknowledged that he treated them fairly and professionally. But in March of last year, on what started as an ordinary spring morning, everything Marcus had built over nearly 3 decades began to crumble like a house of cards in a hurricane. It was a rainy Tuesday morning when the call came in. A young African-American man named Darnell Washington had been found severely beaten in a narrow alley just 2 blocks from Marcus's regular patrol route. The 23-year-old college student was unconscious when paramedics arrived, his face so swollen and bruised that his own mother barely recognized him at the hospital. The city was already on edge. Racial tensions had been simmering for months, following several high-profile incidents across the country. Political rhetoric was heating up as election season approached. The local media was hungry for any story that would generate clicks and controversy and keep viewers glued to their screens. When the initial investigation began, detectives canvassed the area looking for witnesses and evidence. Most of the businesses were closed at that early hour, but there was one security camera mounted on the corner of a nearby building. The footage was grainy and poorly lit, but it clearly showed a tall figure in a dark jacket walking away from the alley around the estimated time of the assault. The figure's face wasn't visible, and the image quality was so poor that identifying specific features was nearly impossible. But someone at the precinct noted that the person in the video appeared to be roughly the same height and build as Detective Marcus Hale. And Marcus had been working the night shift that week, which meant he would have been in the area around the time the assault occurred. Within hours, rumors began to circulate. Whispered conversations in squad cars and break rooms. Speculation and gossip that grew more elaborate with each retelling. By the end of the day, Marcus's name was being mentioned as a possible person of interest. There was no physical evidence linking him to the crime. No witnesses who could positively identify him. No motive that anyone could establish. Just a blurry security camera image of someone who might have looked like him, walking in the general vicinity of where a young black man had been brutally beaten. But in today's climate of instant judgment and social media outrage, that thin thread of circumstantial evidence was enough to set a terrible chain of events in motion. Within 48 hours of Darnell Washington being found, Detective Marcus Hale was suspended from duty without pay, pending a full investigation. The same police chief who had once publicly called Marcus irreplaceable, who had praised his dedication and professionalism at award ceremonies, suddenly wouldn't return his phone calls or meet with him to discuss the situation. The department's public relations office issued a brief, cold statement saying that an officer had been placed on administrative leave in connection with an ongoing investigation, but they declined to provide any additional details. They didn't mention Marcus by name, but in a department where everyone knew everyone else's business, his identity became an open secret within hours. The city didn't wait for due process or a thorough investigation or anything resembling a fair hearing. In the court of public opinion, Marcus Hale was tried, convicted, and sentenced before he even knew what was happening to him. His name began trending on social media platforms. Hashtags calling for justice mixed with hashtags demanding his immediate arrest. Activists organized protests outside the precinct, carrying signs with his photograph and calling him a murderer. Anonymous online accounts shared his home address and encouraged people to make their feelings known. The vandalism started on a Thursday night. Marcus came home from a meeting with his lawyer to find his house defaced with red spray paint. The words "Killer Cop" were scrawled across his front door in letters 3 feet tall. His mailbox had been destroyed. His car windows were smashed. Neighbors who had waved to him for years suddenly looked the other way when they saw him coming. Parents pulled their children inside when he walked down the sidewalk. The grocery store where he had shopped for 2 decades suddenly felt hostile and unwelcoming. Local television news ran sensationalized reports with headlines like "Hero" or "Hypocrite," and the dark side of Detective Hale. They dug up every arrest he had ever made, every use of force report he had ever filed, looking for patterns that might support the narrative they were building. They interviewed people who claimed to have always suspected something wasn't right about him, though none of these individuals had ever made such concerns known before. The department's Internal Affairs Division ordered Marcus not to speak to the media or make any public statements about the case. They said it was to protect the integrity of the investigation, but Marcus suspected it was really to protect the department from further controversy. And Marcus, being the loyal soldier he had always been, obeyed their orders even though every fiber of his being wanted to defend himself and tell his side of the story. As the weeks turned into months, Marcus's world continued to shrink. He was forced to sell his car to pay his mounting legal bills. Then he had to sell his house, the home where he had lived with Margaret, where they had raised their daughter, where he had planned to spend his retirement years. He moved into a cheap motel on the outskirts of town, a depressing place that rented rooms by the week to people who had nowhere else to go. The walls were thin, the carpet was stained, and the air conditioning barely worked. It was a far cry from the comfortable home he had worked so hard to build and maintain. The legal proceedings dragged on with agonizing slowness. The department never formally charged Marcus with any crime. The district attorney's office reviewed the evidence multiple times, but ultimately declined to prosecute, citing insufficient evidence to prove guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. But no apology came with that decision. No acknowledgement of the damage that had been done to his reputation and his life. There was no reinstatement to his position, no restoration of his pension benefits, no recognition of his decades of faithful service. Just silence, cold, institutional silence that said more than any words could have conveyed. For months, Marcus essentially disappeared from public view. Some people assumed he had moved away to start over somewhere else. Others thought he had simply given up, crushed by the weight of false accusations and public humiliation. A few wondered if he might have taken his own life, overwhelmed by despair and shame. But Marcus Hale was stronger than that. He was hurt, certainly. He was angry and frustrated and heartbroken. But he had not given up. He was waiting, quietly and patiently, for the truth to emerge, because he knew, with absolute certainty, that the truth would eventually come to light. It always did, even if it took longer than anyone hoped or expected. 9 months after that terrible Tuesday morning when Darnell Washington was found beaten in the alley, a young patrol officer named Jamie Lynn was working late one night, reviewing old case files as part of a routine audit. Jamie was relatively new to the force, having joined just 2 years earlier after graduating from the police academy with honors. As she worked her way through a stack of evidence boxes, Jamie discovered something that made her blood run cold. In the file related to the Washington assault case, buried beneath dozens of witness statements and forensic reports, she found a time-stamped log from a traffic camera located several miles away from the crime scene. The timestamp showed that at the exact time Darnell Washington was being attacked, Marcus Hale's patrol car had been captured on camera at a completely different location across town, responding to a domestic disturbance call. The electronic log from his radio confirmed that he'd been tied up with that incident for over an hour, making it physically impossible for him to have been anywhere near the alley where the assault occurred. This crucial piece of evidence had somehow been overlooked during the initial investigation. Whether it was due to incompetence, negligence, or something more sinister, Jamie couldn't say. But she knew that this information could exonerate Detective Hale and prove his innocence beyond any shadow of doubt. Jamie took her discovery to the Internal Affairs Division, her hands shaking as she presented the evidence. The investigators reviewed the timestamp data and cross-referenced it with multiple sources. They confirmed its authenticity and accuracy. And then, According to Jamie, they panicked. Realizing the enormous mistake that had been made, the city quietly reached out to Marcus through his attorney. They offered him a settlement package that would have made him financially comfortable for the rest of his life. The deal came with one condition: no media attention, no public statements, no acknowledgement of wrongdoing on the part of the city or the police department. But Marcus Hale declined their offer. Money wasn't what he wanted. Financial compensation couldn't repair the damage that had been done to his reputation, his relationships, and his peace of mind. What Marcus wanted was something much simpler and much more important: the truth. Public acknowledgement of his innocence, his good name restored. Instead of accepting the city's settlement offer, Marcus made a decision that surprised everyone who knew him. On a cold Monday morning in December, nearly a year after his nightmare had begun, he put on his best suit, straightened his shoulders, and walked slowly and deliberately through the front doors of the 11th precinct. The desk sergeant looked up in shock as Marcus entered the building where he had worked for nearly 3 decades. Officers stopped their conversations and stared as he made his way through the familiar hallways, past the bulletin boards and commendation plaques and group photographs that told the story of his long career. Marcus didn't raise his voice or make any demands. He didn't threaten lawsuits or media exposure. He simply walked into the office of the new captain, a man he had never met before, and placed a manila folder on his desk. The folder contained all the evidence that proved his innocence: the traffic camera footage, the radio logs, the timeline that made it impossible for him to have committed the crime he'd been accused of. Marcus looked the captain in the eye and said, in a voice that was quiet but filled with quiet dignity, "Clear my name. That's all I want. Just clear my name." A week later, the city held a press conference. The mayor, flanked by the police chief and the district attorney, read a formal statement acknowledging that Detective Marcus Hale had been wrongfully accused and that new evidence had conclusively proven his innocence. Her voice shook as she offered the city's sincere apologies for the pain and suffering he had endured. The police department offered to reinstate Marcus with full pension benefits and back pay for all the time he had been suspended. They offered him a promotion and a commendation for his years of exemplary service. They offered him everything they thought might help repair the damage they had caused. Marcus politely declined the job offer. At 62 years old, after everything he had been through, he no longer had the heart for police work, but he accepted the acknowledgement of his innocence and the restoration of his reputation. That was all he had ever really wanted. Marcus used the settlement money to buy back his old house from the family that had purchased it. He spent months repairing the damage that had been done, repainting the walls, replacing the broken windows, restoring it to the way it had been when he and Margaret had been happy there together. Months later, a reporter from the local newspaper tracked him down for a follow-up story. She asked him what had hurt the most during his ordeal. Marcus thought for a long moment before answering. "Not the lie," he said finally. "The silence that followed. The way people I had known and worked with for decades just disappeared. That hurt more than any false accusation ever could." When the reporter asked what he had learned from his experience, Marcus walked over to a mantelpiece where his old police badge sat in a place of honor next to his wife's photograph. He picked it up and held it in his weathered hands, feeling its familiar weight. "Some things you carry for life," he said softly, his voice barely above a whisper. "Not because they're perfect, but because you are who you are. This badge doesn't make me a good person. Being a good person is what gave meaning to this badge." And that perhaps is the most important lesson of Marcus Hale's story. In a world where truth seems increasingly rare and justice often feels elusive, character matters. Integrity matters. The way we treat one another, especially when no one is watching, matters more than we might ever realize. Marcus Hale's ordeal has ended, but the message he leaves us continues to resonate. Sometimes life tests us in ways we never imagined possible. Sometimes lies seem to triumph over truth, and injustice appears to prevail over righteousness. But if we hold fast to our principles, if we maintain our dignity even in the face of false accusations and public humiliation, the truth will eventually emerge. Real strength isn't found in never falling down. Real strength is found in getting back up, brushing yourself off, and continuing to be the person you know yourself to be, regardless of what others might think or say or believe about you. We all carry invisible badges of one kind or another, badges that represent our values, our commitments, our sense of right and wrong. And like Marcus Hale's police badge, these invisible badges derive their meaning not from their perfection, but from the imperfect people who choose to carry them with honor, day after day, year after year, even when the whole world seems to be watching and waiting for us to fail. That is the legacy of Detective Marcus Hale. That is the lesson his story teaches us. And that is why his name, once dragged through the mud by false accusations and public hysteria, now stands as a symbol of quiet dignity, unwavering integrity, and the unshakable belief that truth, however long delayed, will always find a way to shine through the darkness.